Hi, I want to make a video on self-perception, and I don't know exactly, like many of these videos, exactly what I wanted to label, really cover in this video, um, but I guess I really just want to wing it, if you want to say it that way. So self-perception, self-esteem, how you view yourself is important, you're in your own shoes, and that's how you perceive most things. And that's how we perceive most things, is from our own point of view. We intimately experience our own feelings more than we feel other people's feelings, but that's where things like empathy and sympathy come from, but those things come from you because you're feeling them based on your own egotistical mechanism, feeling like I wouldn't want to be in that circumstance, and this is how we always think about these circumstances. I wouldn't want to be in this circumstance, so why would I expect anyone else to want to be in the circumstance? So it's only reasonable because I wouldn't want to be in the circumstance for no one else to want to be in the circumstance because I know the circumstance sucks. I mean, even if you don't think of it necessarily consciously think of it that way, that's what's going on because you know it sucks. And you can put yourself in their shoes and imagine it sucking. You know they're suffering, and you know you wouldn't want to suffer. Therefore, if you connect all the dots, you realize it's coming from yourself and all these feelings. You feel bad because that person's feeling bad. And at the very least, that's what you know. It's because you don't want to feel bad because that person's feeling bad, so you're going to feel bad if that person's feeling bad, and that's where the conscious to subconscious reaction comes in, because even if you're not consciously thinking about you don't want to experience it yourself, you're experiencing negative sensations right now. You don't want to feel negative because the person that's experiencing the negative that you have empathy for is feeling a negative. So you want to fix their problem because they're experiencing some kind of negative. And that's exactly what you want to do. You want to fix their problem. You want to come to their aid. And because you feel bad and you're not going to feel good until their problem is fixed, until you know they feel better. And that's where it comes in self-perception, your self-esteem, how you view yourself, vanity, vain, superficiality, how you perceive yourself, your perception in other people's eyes, always, looking through other people's eyes, imagining how you are perceived through other people's eyes. And that's how we function a lot in this existence, is sentient existence, practically speaking, and the functionality of our psychology. We think about how other people perceive us. We have this idea in our head about how we perceive ourselves. We perceive ourselves. Okay, I think I get the idea. See, this is where it leads. I go off on a tangent. I just go off and I remember that. So yeah. Anyway, um, phone's going, but I'm gonna let it go for this time because I'm just remembering this idea I was talking about. So the idea I was talking about was this perception that you have of yourself viewing through other people's eyes. So you're perceiving yourself through other people's eyes, and this is helping you have a perception of yourself because you want to seem a certain way because of other people's perception. Because you want to have a certain, you want to seem a certain way because people are looking at you, or you want to seem a certain way because you view yourself in other people's eyes, and you want, sorry, the phone thing was distracting me. Anyway, you're viewing yourself through other people's eyes, and you are viewing through your other people's eyes, viewing you, imagining yourself, and you want to seem a certain way, and you have a certain perception of how you're going to look in other people's eyes, and that's exactly based on your perception, but you don't realize how your perception can be fooling you into thinking or imagining differently. It could be different. You don't necessarily know that's the case. Um, so you have a self-perception, and your self-perception has a bias of its own perception. So you have a bias of your own self-perception. Um, so you can only view from your own self-perception, going through your own filters and how you're going to view other people viewing yourself. So you're viewing yourself through the filters in which you think other people are going to view you. And it goes back to the empathy thing too, because it's all coming from an internal egotistical mechanism, how you're viewing based on how other egotistical mechanism, because this egotistical mechanism is controlling how you feel for others and how much empathy you'll have for someone else. And this empathy that you have, it really the feeling is coming from you, and the feeling is being projected onto someone else, but it's coming from you. So like your sexual feelings are coming from inside. um, the feelings of sexuality are all these feelings are just delusions or just gratifications. You're a victim of your wants and needs. Are coming from inside of you, And these wants or needs are just projections. They come from inside of you, projections, wants and needs, victim of your wants and needs, projecting out. And that's all you are, is you're a victim of the wants and needs, and you're projecting out based on something that's happening inside of here, inside of me. And it's something that's happening inside of me, and nothing more. My ego, what I want, what I desire, what I want for other people, what I perceive in other people, how I view other people perceiving me, all comes down to self-perception and how I'm viewing myself and how other people view me, and how I can understand other people and how I can come to a mutual understanding of other people based on how I would see myself, or how I would think that other people would understand, say, my description of something, coming to a mutual description of something, and how I'd perceive other people and understanding my description and saying, okay, at least we reached a mutual point. We got this far. Let's come back later and we can try to reach a certain point later on in the discussion. And that's how we come to these conclusions. It's from an understanding, a self-perception, a self-understanding. Self-esteem is another thing. Self-awareness, being self-aware of the environment based on this mechanism, creating the ego itself. That's based on this consciousness thing that we have, self-esteem, how you feel about yourself, your projections of yourself, and it usually comes down to how you think other people, putting yourself in other people's shoes, putting yourself in other people's shoes and looking trying to look from their point of view, from your point of view inside of you, projecting that onto their point of view as if you were them, and then projecting it back onto yourself as if you understand exactly what's going through someone's brain. Even if they say something you were expecting them to say, does not automatically mean that what you thought, according to what you thought they were going to say, and they end up saying what you thought they were going to say, doesn't mean that they're exactly thinking what you thought they were going to say. They say you're ugly, and you think you're ugly, and you thought they were going to think you were ugly, and then they say you're ugly. It doesn't mean that they think you're ugly for the wrong reason, or for the same reasons you think you're ugly. I guess for like body dysmorphic disorder or something, or self-esteem problems, going back to the self-esteem. Yeah, it doesn't mean they think you're ugly. They could just be reacting. They could have had a bad day. They're just saying you're ugly for whatever reason. And all of a sudden it validates everything you think about yourself. So all of a sudden all the things that they said and all the associations that you have based on your own self-perception and self-esteem and self-awareness are going to be associated. So all the things, okay, I'm ugly, I have a ugly this ugly, that ugly, all these associations and negative associations, whatever associations are going to come in, and those associations are going to all of a sudden be, they're going to bleed over into what that person said. They're going to bleed over into that person's perception. All of a sudden, that person's perception becomes the same perception that you had, because you're viewing based on those associations, sort of like letting your psychology get in the way of philosophy, letting the subjective, being caught up in the moment kind of thing take over your rationality, even though you don't realize that your projection based on what they say is completely disconnected. What they think, and it's just based on your perception, based on your perspective and projection, and putting that in their mouth. And then you're expecting that to mean something, even though there's a complete disconnect, because they are two different people. Even though you're in the same mechanism, these fundamental aspects of our character and our psychology are completely distinct and separate from one another. They're interacting, but they're distinct, and these things happening inside, even though they're interacting with the outside environment, and the perception and everything in our projection, the thing is happening inside of our brain. The interaction with the environment is happening inside of our brain, and our perception, and these interactions and these associations are happening in here, and here, and here. They're happening in here. They're happening nowhere else but here. Here. Yes, here. Sexual preferences, all your sexual gratifications coming from in here. Everything is happening in here. Nothing more, nothing less. So all of a sudden, the association makes these associations. It connects the dots, these ABs, these interactions, creating these associations, and that's how we think, is based on a logical conclusion based on associations. So even though, like back to the thinking thing, your thinking is A to C, it's still logically going from A to B. The very function of it going leap in logic, even though you go from A to C or you come to a completely wrong conclusion, that 1 + 1 = 3, the functionality of the existence creating that is still objective. So you're still objectively interacting. You're still doing something. There's still an interaction happening on a certain level. Sort of like there's an interaction, the thing that allowed the 1 + 1 = 3 is still happening. It's still happening, and it's happening, the interaction, the fundamental interaction that allows it, the cause and effect interaction that allows it to happen is still happening. It's just the 1 to 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3 doesn't exist. It's like the contrivances. You can create a contrivance, and even though the contrivance or the contradiction or the conundrum or the paradox, 1 plus 1 is a paradox, equals 3 is a paradox, 1 plus 1 equals 3 is a paradox. It's a contrivance, though, but the contrivance, sort of like it doesn't matter what you think, and if you think wrong, the contrivance still exists in reality, based on the thing that allowed you to come up with that contrivance, the mechanism that allowed you to think or say something, the disconnection between your speech and the reality is there's a distinction. What you say is just a disconnection between what is, and what you say exists, or like what you think exists, and the thing that allows you to think a certain thing exists. It's still an objective thing that's existing, that's allowing that, because it's a function that leads up to a function. The deterministic mechanism allows that to be an objective function that's happening. It's just you're leading it to a distinction. Is it doesn't matter what you think, something's existing no matter what. And it doesn't matter what you think. And reality doesn't need you to think or project onto it any kind of thinking or some kind of irrational thought. It doesn't need you or your thoughts for it to exist in a certain way. It's existing in a certain way regardless of how you perceive reality or not. So it's existing regardless of what you think or say or whatever you perceive it. It's the very thing that's allowing you to think or perceive. It's the thing that's creating the thinking process, but there's a distinction between that thinking process. So it doesn't matter what you think. There's a thinking process. You think a certain way, it's a projection, and it doesn't matter what your projection is, it exists a certain way, but the thing that allows it to happen, that's happening a certain way, is the thing that's making what exactly the process of what you're doing mean that has an objective that's objective, because the process that created that thought's objective, but it doesn't need you for it to be objective. It's objective regardless, and that goes back to the distinction between the interaction that you have, say, saying something verbally and making those distinctions, and actually something existing in reality. So there's a distinction there, and it doesn't need you for to make that distinction, but the thing that makes that distinction that you made, or the distinction or whatever it may have been that doesn't exist, it's the thing that created that process to allow that conclusion to happen, because everything we do is based on a fundamental mechanism. You come to the wrong conclusion because of all these different things happening leading up to where you are, because it's a deterministic mechanism that allows that, based on cause and effect leading up to where you are now, that creates your perception and how you think and how you react, and that's objective. The process creating you is objective, but it doesn't need the process that you think doesn't need the process outside of ourselves doesn't need us to think or project onto it. And that goes back to the distinction between my projection, the interaction that's happening. It can end, and that interaction exists, but it can also not exist. It can end, it cannot end. A different interaction can happen regardless, and that goes to the distinction between me, the interaction, and the thing that I'm describing. So there's interactions and distinctions that can be made regardless, and they exist in reality regardless of what you think. Okay? Simple? Yeah. Anyway, so your self-perception, I want to go back to the ugly example before I end this video. So the ugly example I was mentioning in the more close to the beginning of this video is this interaction. So you project on others, and this goes back more to psychology than philosophy, and I'm describing this, so it's more kind of a mix between a psychology and a philosophy video. The distinction I want to make is that we do project. So a person says you're ugly, and we make these associations, right? And these associations mean something to a certain degree, because we only have our psychology. That's all we have. We only have our perception, our self-awareness, our self-esteem comes from us. And our projections mean only something. Our ego, our empathy comes from us. There are these feelings, these sexual gratification, anything, any feeling we have comes inside of us, because we can't have empathy or any of these interactions unless there's an us and an us feeling it to interact with the environment, to the thing that we're interacting in pain. So it's like a one-on-one relationship. I'm reacting only because I exist to react to certain situations. I'm reacting and I exist because I'm interacting, and I can only exist the way I am because I'm interacting, because the thing that I'm interacting with is something I'm having empathy for, I'm interacting with. So it's a one-to-one relationship, because it's sort of like, by definition, you're describing one-to-one exactly what's happening, just from a different point of view. So I'm existing to interact, I'm interacting to exist, and you're describing in a kind of one-to-one kind of way, describing the situation. And how I'm describing the situation in of itself, and it's by its very own definition describing one-in-one, one-to-one ratio, the exact thing that's happening. Sort of like using a definition in a word, one-to-one. As close as we can get at least, right? Anyway, trying to think. Okay, so anyway, back to the ugly example, like I wanted to get back to. So yes, they say you're ugly. You have a circumstance. You have these associations from what you thought and what they're going to say. So you have a thought. They say you're ugly. You have a preconceived notion. You thought they were going to say ugly. And when they said ugly, all of a sudden, based on what you perceive as ugly and what you're projecting on that person thinks is ugly, all of a sudden what you think is all of a sudden what that person thinks exactly, and that comes back on you, and all of a sudden all those associations connect the dots, all those associations connect, and all of a sudden they think exactly what you were thinking, and they see exactly what you're seeing, and all of a sudden, even though what their circumstance can be completely different, and why they're saying or describing something a certain way, doesn't mean it's exactly the same thing. But your projection, your self-esteem, all you have is your psychology, and that's all that we have. This is the interaction. And that's the distinction I think a lot of people miss. Is just because all we have is our psychology and this interaction, and I can describe anything I want, doesn't mean that it's not happening a certain way. My psychology is happening a certain way, the interaction is happening a certain way, the thing that created my psychology is happening a certain way, the thing outside of myself is happening a certain way, my description, my knowledge, all these different things, the way I decide to describe something, the way I interact with something, is all objective because it's happening a way. It is what it is, sort of like that kind of cliche kind of idea. Yeah, so it's that kind of cliche. It is what it is. The platitude, the cliche platitude. It is what it is, and that's exactly what it is. It is what it is, and that's what it is. Obviously, we're trying better to describe things better in reality than it is what it is, because that's obviously not adequate enough, and try to make a mutual understandings. We need to be a little more descriptive in our mutual understandings for everyone to get to at least a common level of understanding and understanding these concepts. And that's exactly what we're doing. And we're trying to get as far as we can in description and be as exact as possible. And it's not pointless to get as exact as possible, because at least we can recognize, okay, let's take a step back and see where we made a mistake here. And then we can go forward again until we get more descriptive and more descriptive and more descriptive. And we can come as close as we can, even though we may not reach the end. It's just becoming more precise in our language so that there's a better, closer mutual understanding, even though, and even though you think someone understands what you're saying. Then you all of a sudden the subject changes, and you get a little more descriptive in your description of something. And all of a sudden a person's like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, you say you describe a certain situation, you describe an ailment you have, and the person's like, oh, I understand exactly. Like, people say, oh, I'm depressed. Oh, I know how you feel, buddy. I've been there before. And then you say, oh, you know what depression's like. You got this thing, and then they agree, but all of a sudden you say a unique symptom that you have of depression, or something that they don't have, and then all of a sudden the thing changes, and they don't necessarily understand what you're saying. They understand, oh, I understand, buddy. Pat you on the back. Oh, yeah, I understand what you're saying, buddy. Buddy, you know what I mean? And then all of a sudden you say one more thing. It's like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. No, I don't know. They just dismiss you in a way. They use a specific example, and they dismiss you, and it becomes kind of that kind of thing. So they dismiss you, and that becomes like one of those cliche things where they didn't really understand what you're saying, and that comes through the frustration of trying to portray a language to people, and you have to talk a certain way, say something. You can't stumble on your words. You can't forget, like I did in this video. You can't forget what you're saying. All of a sudden, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah, oh, I have a time to refute him. Oh, he's stupid. He's stupid. He paused. Alert, robotic response. Yes, he paused. Therefore, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Therefore, I can completely dismiss what he's saying. I completely belittle his intelligence, and I could do whatever I want to belittle him and deny him because he paused. You have to say things a certain way. And I think people that are stupid and don't have much awareness are in denial, and they understand to a certain extent, or they're just very ignorant. And I think the very ignorant are more easy to convince than the deniers. And I think the deniers and the ignorant, if you're both of them, then you're very obnoxious. But I think even deny and ignorance are easier to overcome, but it just takes different strategies, emotional strategies or intellectual strategies. I think you can attack an ignorant person more intellectually and emotionally, but a person that's in denial has to attack more emotionally. I guess that's a tactic you can use in describing and arguing the truth with someone or trying to get the truth across to someone. So yeah, yeah, um, so yeah, so yeah, back to the example I was using again with the ugly. I keep going back to that example. So you're ugly, right? So you're ugly. Okay, let me get this straight. You're ugly. Yeah, and I guess I want to touch on one more thing, and this it's sort of like things happen a certain way. You can imagine them happening a certain way, um, and outcomes, right? So you can expect certain outcomes to happen a certain way, and you say this would be the way it was going to happen, but since it didn't happen, sort of like the phone call, I'm thinking, that happened. It's sort of like you expect, okay, how would have things would have gone? But now that things would have gone, the person say what happened then, they describe it differently than say if you were to interact with them. Therefore, say if I called the person back or the person that if I call back, then all of a sudden the circumstance changes, and that circumstance wouldn't have existed if I say picked up the phone and answered it. So that the whole thing came up in the idea. I just want to mention that first, so you don't necessarily know what would have happened in that circumstance would have happened. So back to the ugly thing. Um, so yeah, so if I called back, it would be different. So yeah. Anyway, the ugly thing. So you project your self-esteem. You only have your psychology, projection, the distinction making between your projection. Is a distinction. The interaction, the thing that you're interacting with, and all sorts of things. And there is a distinction between psychology and philosophy. And you have to make sure you don't let your psychology get in the way of your philosophy, even though there's a lot of ways it can sort of slip its way through, even though you don't realize that your biases, your subtle biases, can subtly get into your conversation, regardless of how aware you're, or how it's overcoming a weakness. It's overcoming something that you have to get over, and it's not letting your psychology or any kind of bias or anything get in the way. And it's really hard sometimes to fight that. You can only do so much to fight it, and you have to be very aware of what you're saying, like self-awareness. You mean be aware of what's going on, be aware of your environment, be aware of exactly the circumstances happening and what you're saying. Because sometimes I say things, I'm just going off on, I don't even know where I'm going. I'm just saying something based on an idea I had, and then all of a sudden I just sort of say something and I end a sentence, the latter half of the sentence, I don't even know what I was saying, because I was just going. So they think you're ugly. You have a preconception. You know you have a thought what they're going to say, and you have a what they think, and then they say you're ugly, and then all of a sudden you think that they think that you're ugly, based on what you think. You put yourself in their shoes, and you view what they think is of you as ugly the same way you think of you as ugly. So like your self-perception, your ego, your interaction with other people, how you perceive empathy and sympathy. But it doesn't need you to have the pain. It just the interaction exists now that you can try to mitigate against that pain and understanding, and that's a very function of empathy and sympathy, is to make sure that you can mitigate against pain and understand other people's pain and put yourself in their shoe and make it an even more equal playing field, so you're not completely selfish. You can understand more a person's interaction. So it's understanding those distinctions too. What was I gonna say? I can't remember. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. So the ugly thing. Keep going back to the ugly thing. Yeah. So you take that and you view from their point of view, but the interaction's all happening in here, and you have all these associations, and you project on other people's opinions, and all of a sudden you take that person's opinion and you distort it into your opinion, and you project your opinion onto that person's opinion based on associations that a person said. You're ugly, even though they don't think you're ugly, they're just reacting to their own circumstance. All of a sudden you think that they think you're ugly. You put your own version of that in their head, project your own feelings into their head and how you feel. And it's about overcoming those biases, overcoming those things, overcoming those shortcomings, and that comes to that self-awareness thing, and not letting your own biases get in the way and your own perception get in the way, sort of like not letting something like that get in the way. How you can't let your own perception get in the way of what you view as, or the interaction you have with someone else's perception, or having someone else's perception or projection or what they say hurt you or come back on you. And don't project what you have based on what they have. And you have to be a little more self-aware, a little more self-taught, and understanding, have a little more experience in that, and understanding how you can have an interaction with someone and let not get in the way of you as much. So it's about having these things not take control of you. But it's hard not to have those things take control of you. I'm trying to think. Yeah, so you make these associations, and I think you get the point. You have these associations, and you shouldn't let that get to you. And you have your self-perception, that's all we have. Things exist, or self-perception exists. There's a distinction to make. And yeah, that's basically it. That's really all there is to it. We have the self-perception, that's something that exists, and it exists in a certain way, and there's a distinction between the interaction, the thing I'm interacting with, my psychology. All I have is my psychology. That doesn't mean the thing that's outside of us needs us. There's a distinction between us and the interaction. We think all of a sudden, because we have a subjective point of view, all of a sudden that means that everything's subjective. I can say something, but even though I say something, reality is describing me saying that. I can say or describe something, whatever. I can believe whatever I want, but the very fabric of reality happening in the bedrock, very fabric reality of the bedrock of reality describing me and making me exist the way I am is making all these things irrelevant. I can say whatever I want. I can be subjective all I want, but the bedrock of fabric creating the bedrock of reality is the thing. The fabric creating the fabric creating the bedrock of reality, creating me. The fundamental function of reality. I can't change it. So that thing is creating my self-delusion or perception of my own subjective being, is allowing my own subjective perception, self-perception, my own projections, everything is created by the function of reality. So everything is objective, and I can be subjective all I want, but that's only from my point of view. Subjective like free will and objective like determinism. It's happening a certain way, but subjectively and based on my idea that I can move in any circumstance, or I could do something if I'm alive and free. I can perceive that perceptually, but beyond that, deterministic mechanism is controlling you regardless. I can move. I'm moving in a certain way, but we don't know where that move is coming from. Our free will ends at our thoughts, or whatever you want to call it, but it ends but the beginning is determinism. Determinism overcomes the free will, or whatever you wanted to say is free will, the idea that I can move or think in any circumstance regardless, something is going to happen. I have so many ideas, so I'm talking so fast anyway. And that deterministic mechanism controls us more than that. And the controlling thing is controlling our thoughts and perceptions and the interaction that we have to allow us to think, deluded, or have our own subjective opinion is the objective, allowing us to experience a subjective, a free will, a perception. The subjective free will that we experience, or what we perceive, the subjective and free will are synonymous, sort of like the objective determinism that's pushing us forward. We can have more subjective, we can move, think, and thing whatever we feel, but that ends at our thoughts based on a deterministic mechanism controlling us going into the future and so on, controlling us, allowing us to think a certain way to begin with. And that's making us think a certain way, even though we think that we're allowing ourselves to think a certain way. That thing is controlling the fact that I'm thinking a certain way. So it's coming from something else. So the deterministic mechanism is creating my thoughts the way they are right now, regardless of me thinking they're subjective. They're objective based on determinism, and I think they're subjective based on, I don't think, but I perceive that way, even though the end are thoughts, and the thoughts have to come from somewhere. And based on the circumstances, based on the deterministic mechanism, leading into the future, going forward, doing something, and that's exactly what is happening, going into the future. This way. This way. Yeah. This way. I mean, this way. Yeah. Anyway, trying to think, is there anything else I want to add? So yeah, we perceive subjective free will, or whatever you want to call it. We can think, move in our own boundaries, but it's coming from something that's allowing us to think it. I can think that nothing matters, this is this, and I can deny the truth all I want. That's our own subjective, our own free will, the two synonymous words that I want to make a distinction with. Free will, determinism, free, subjective, objective, free will, determinism, subjective, determinism, subjective, free will. I have a subjective, I view perceptually, it ends at our thoughts, and our thoughts come from something based on the interaction, based on cause-effect interaction, chaotic mechanism caused by determinism, leading into a futuristic mechanism, leading into the future. Future, man. Yeah, but anyway, it's based on something, and the thing that allows our subjective free will, our subjective point of view, or denial of reality, whatever we want to think, our subjective point of view is created by a deterministic mechanism. That goes back to the idea the reality doesn't need our subjective point of view for it to be objective. It's just another objective point of view It's just another thing objectively happening, another subjective point of view objectively happening, having an interaction with the environment. And that's exactly the interaction happening. The interaction is objective. Everything's objective. Regardless of what you think, it's happening a certain way. Regardless of what you think. Sorry. That's the way it works. Sorry. And we're stuck in the crude mechanism. And that's where we're stuck in that mechanism. So we're stuck in the mechanism, and there's nothing we can do. Yeah, sorry for a long video. I just wanted to make sure I got all those. I made the points several times, but I'm trying to connect all these points into one point. Trying to make all these ideas coherent as possible. So, sorry. I don't know what I'm doing. Anyway, yeah. In my face, and there's a screen on here I'm looking at when I'm looking at this, and I'm constantly going between here and here. Guess I'm looking how I'm looking. My self-perception's controlling me. Did I look good from this side or this side? Ew. I don't know. Anyway, I think that's all I want to say. I think you get the point good enough. So thank you, and until next time. Bye.